those who are already on board, please think a little bit about that question. One positive strategy that you've experienced or initiative carried out by your leader or your department or your organisation that has helped your experience as a female researcher or academic, I guess, a female academic. And then try and see if you can put it in a category. I thought it might be nice to share some positive stories today, as well as some of the challenges. So that's why I'm asking you to share a positive story, just very briefly, something that's worked or helped you. And I will share one that helped me actually in my career. I don't know whether universities still do this actually, but when I had twins, and there was a policy of the university I was working with at the time, which was UNSW, that they, and I was doing a keynote speech. So I was living in Sydney, I was doing a keynote speech in Melbourne. They actually paid to fly my parents over from Perth to Melbourne to look after my twins, who were only 6 weeks old at the time, while I did the keynote speech. And I thought that was actually terrific because, they didn't say, oh, we're only going to pay for, I don't know, a nanny or something. I mean, I wasn't going to give my 6-week-old babies to a nanny. I needed my mum and dad to be helping. And so that was, that's something that stuck in my mind. I don't know whether universities still do that. I hope so. Does anyone know? So that's an example of a positive short story. So look, welcome everybody. I'm going to get started now. So we will keep that little question up there, and you can go to the slido.com and share your positive story. And Annika's then going to share some positive things. And part of the reason I wanted to collect some positive stories is because I know that today we have some leaders of departments and universities and research centres joining us. And so it's really great for them to hear what has worked for you and what has supported you in the past. So as usual today, I'm going to encourage you to share your face if you feel comfortable, because it is lovely to see who's on the call. And if you need any help, just reach out in the chat to our support team. I'd like to acknowledge today that I'm on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Perth, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and do feel free to share which lands you are on today and you pay respect to. We're really excited today to have two wonderful ARC Laureate Fellows join us. First of all, Professor Tessa Morris-Suzuki, and second, Professor Sundhya Pahuja. So they'll come on a little bit later, and then we'll have our question and answer session. So do feel free to pop questions in Slido or into the chat. I want to start with the why. So today we are focusing on this question of what is it that leaders and organisations, so universities or research centres, can actually do to support females' careers. But I want to start with the why. Why do we even have to ask that question? Haven't we been thinking about this for decades and trying to change things? Well, what I did was just very quickly extracted the latest selection results from the some of the ARC projects. Now, I'm not going to show you them all, and I realise this is just a very partial slice of outcomes, but I do just want to share those with you. Now, what you can see here is the recipients down the bottom, and you can see blue is men and the red is women. So you can just see straight away that many, many more male men are getting linkage grants. I think this was 2024, it might have been 25. It was just whatever the latest data was. What's interesting though, these other figures that you can see across the top are success rates. So actually the success rates for men and women are reasonably similar, but women are not putting in for these grants as much as men. You'll see that pattern even more clearly in the next figure. So here, let's look at future fellows. So now going to sort of a prestigious award, research award. Again, you see the blue here is men. So many more men getting these awards relative to women. But you can see the success rates. That's the success rate. The red is the success rate for women, and the blue is the success rate for men. You can actually see the success rate for women is higher. So in other words, if women put in, they're more likely to get them. But one of the challenges here is women are not putting in as many applications as men. And so you know, something is happening to explain that. We see, and you get some weird figures here, by the way, because these are to do with non-binary, and they're just, the numbers are so low, so you get some weird figures. So I won't worry about that at the minute. Let's look at laureates, obviously relevant to our discussion today. But again, what you see is these blue bars, more men are getting them. But again, you see sort of similar success rates. So similar, once you put in as a female, you're reasonably just as likely as a man to get one, but women are not putting in these applications. And so, you know, I think this just highlights why this question that we're addressing today, what is it that leaders can do? What is it that organisations, universities can do is really important. Oh, there's one more. I actually shared this after the last round of Centre of Excellences. This is not this round. They haven't released the results yet for this round. And this was an analysis that I did of whether the director of successful centres was male or female. And as you can see, there was only one successful Centre of Excellence that had a female as the director. So what explains these different outcomes? Well, there could be a hypothesis that women are just not as smart as men. That is just not true. And this is actually, I just took that from ChatGPT, you can probably recognize it. But the reality is there's a masses of research to show that there are not differences in the intelligence of men. Is there a difference in aspirations? Well, this is a bit more subtle question, actually. If you look straight out at, you know, aspirations for meaningful careers and things like this, there's no difference for men and women. If you look at more extrinsically orientated aspirations, like having a high salary or getting promoted, men do tend to rate themselves as being stronger on those sorts of more extrinsically oriented and aspirations. I think that connects back to men as being a traditional breadwinner, sort of higher focus on status and those sorts of things. So there is a difference in aspirations, but it is particularly around that what we would call extrinsic focus. But those other four things that I've listed there are the main explanations, I would suggest, of why we get these differences in outcomes as a function of gender. And we've talked about this a lot on our Women in Research series, different opportunities for networking, evidence that women tend to get assigned less interesting projects, lots of evidence of stereotypes and bias and discrimination occurring in hiring, promotion, performance assessments, and so on. Different care responsibilities has a big impact. And also there are some, you know, straight out, much more negative experiences for women. Oh, and sorry, this little figure here is aspirations. And this is just an example of that sort of point I made about more extrinsically oriented aspirations. So this is actually this is lawyers, whether you want to be an equity partner in your firm. And what it shows is going from no, I don't, to I very high, want to be a partner. You can see that in the very high, it's a really strong aspiration. It's just all men. And at the, not at all. you see many more women saying, well, no, I don't have that aspiration. So this is sort of connected to that research that I said around that extrinsic focus. So how do we change the situation and who is responsible? There's a really nice review paper that just came out in 2023 that I recommend anyone who wants to dive deeper into this research can look at. And this figure is from that paper. What this figure shows, of course, and we all know this, is that there is multiple factors at play here, ranging from very broad historical factors or legislative factors or cultural factors, expectations about men versus women and so on, ranging down to the organisational level, different opportunities, as we've said, and then down to the interpersonal level. The way that men and women are led can be quite different. The opportunities for mentoring and so on can be quite different. And then right in the middle, there's the different ways in which men and women can also behave in these situations. A lot of our Women in Research series focus on this, what is it we can do ourselves to address some of these challenges that we face? And that's not because women are to blame or they are the only ones responsible, but because that is often what's within our sphere of control. We can't necessarily change the wider things in the circles, but we can change how we behave and how we respond to the situation. So as an example, and I'm doing a bit of advertising here for the Women in Research series, we have a session on what do you say yes to, what do you say no to? So how do we deal with workload as women researchers? We also can think more about what can we do as colleagues to support each other. And one of the Women in Research sessions that we had was all about how do we collaborate with women rather than compete, and what's the value of that, and what are some models for that. And somebody shared, actually, when we did that session, a really nice example of how we can act as colleagues to support women. And this was a LinkedIn post, actually, where the person said, look, looking at that panel, you probably can't see it because it's too small, but it's all men on this panel. And this person has posted and said, well, look, these colleagues are fantastic, but an all-male panel is not okay, and so on. So we can act ourselves to support gender equality. What can we do as leaders? And we'll delve more into this in today's session. But lots of our Women in Research sessions have tackled things like harassment. How do you deal with that? The breaking through the glass ceiling and glass walls. What is the role of leaders in that process? And that third one there, mentors and sponsors. And I'm not sure if everyone can remember, but we talked about the value of mentoring, but also the value of sponsoring women. So as a leader, you might not just give people advice and so on, but you actually might advocate for them into exciting projects. Or if someone asks you for, hey, who's a really excellent colleague who could help, you would put their name forward. So you actually sponsor them more actively than mentoring alone. And then, of course, we can look at that organisational system. What policies and practices can universities put in place that actually help? And I'm actually going to encourage anyone who's really interested in this topic to go back to webinar number 15, because we really went through all of these policies that I've put here, like what can universities do to build opportunities for women to engage in mentoring and get sponsorship? What can they do around networking? How do you eliminate bias in selection processes and so on? Because we know that that is part of it, and that stems often out of stereotypes of what men and women are good at. How do we have better policies to allow flexibility for women and support their return to work? I gave the example when I was supported to return to work through that paying for my parents to babysit my kids when I did a keynote talk, but other strategies. What's leadership development might be targeted specifically at women is important because we are underrepresented with female leaders. I didn't show you those statistics, but we all know that. Sometimes positive action can play a role, and also things like transparency, like showing the numbers. What are the numbers for salaries for men versus women? These things can also kickstart change in organisations. But I particularly encourage you to go back to this one if you didn't already see it, because we had a Professor Peter Taylor from the University of Melbourne, come and share with us an initiative that they introduced to boost the number of female mathematics professors. I can't remember the details, but at the time, I think there was 0 or 1 or some tiny number of maths professors at the University of Melbourne that were female. So they decided to engage in positive action. They advertised only for female maths professors. Now, you can imagine this was a very contentious move. It often causes a backlash. Often women are upset by this strategy as well because they feel like they don't need special treatment, they can get there on their merits and so on. But Peter describes this experiment, I suppose, almost, this initiative that they tried that was ultimately incredibly successful. And yes, there was backlash, and he'll share that with you. But ultimately, he talks about how it really transformed the culture of the mathematics department at the University of Melbourne. And one of the things that I love that he says, and I think is important, is that yes, there was immediate backlash and issues, but now no one remembers that. And what you have is this healthy new culture with more female professors, and people can't even remember the history of it. So, you know, sometimes these things are just a bit of pain, but for a longer term gain. So I encourage you to go back to that one if you didn't watch it. Now I'm just going to answer 2 of the many questions that you sent us, and then we will hand to our laureates. So the role of senior women, there's this question here. You can see someone has sent in, are there any tips on navigating senior academic women gaslighting or constraining junior women academics? A collaborative environment where we support everyone equally should be the aim, but women targeting other women seems increasingly common. So this, in the 1970s, some researchers introduced the term queen bee phenomenon, which you may or may not have heard of. But it is this phenomenon where senior women get to a leadership position or senior position, and they deliberately distance themselves from other women. Sometimes they might also treat other women harshly, but they certainly are not helping or advocating for senior women. I think it's really important to understand why might senior women behave this way, because it's, in fact, as research shows, it's really a reaction to gender bias that those women themselves have often experienced. So a lot of the time that the senior women who behave like this, of course, there will be exceptions, but a lot of the time on average, it's because they have perhaps gone through quite tough times to get to their senior position. They perhaps had to internalize quite masculine ways of behaving, like being quite competitive. They probably had to be extra super good to get promoted. They might also feel like, because they're sort of biased against women, that they have to distance themselves from other women and show that they're different. So ultimately, this way of being a bit distant from other women, not necessarily helping them, is actually a response to the gender bias that those women have experienced. I think it's really important to remember that, or to think about that, to be aware of that. because it just may help in navigating how do you deal with this particular situation. I think so. How do you respond? Practically, what could you do if you felt you had a boss, a senior woman in the department, and that person was not helping or perhaps even hindering your career? Well, the first thing is I would say check your own expectations and bias. Why do I say this? Because in other Women in Research sessions, we've talked about how there is an expectation that women will be communal and women will be helpful and mentor other people. And that's a stereotype of women, that they are expected to be, caring and nurturing and supportive. And as I've shared in other Women in Research sessions, when women don't behave that way, they actually get punished more than if men don't behave that way. And there's some very solid research showing that. In other words, we sort of expect women to behave in this way. It's consistent with the gender stereotype of women being communal. And when they don't, it can be more confronting than if men don't behave in that way. So I guess that's why I'm saying first check your own bias. Are you having unrealistic or unfair in some ways expectations of your senior women that you wouldn't have of men? So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be to recognize, as I've said, that for some of these senior women, this is very much a response to the situation they've been in for their career. So keep it professional and don't internalize the problem and feel like it's you that's at fault. It's perhaps very much a reflection of the system of people in it. Some suggest that it's better to engage the women, like asking for advice, focusing on shared goals rather than challenge. I think that one might depend on a number of different factors, but also build a wider support network. If you have a female boss who is, perhaps behaving a little bit like this queen bee syndrome suggests, then maybe you need to expand your network. Also, advocating for those wider organisational policies. So if we change the system, then we get situations where women are not facing this sort of bias. And so then they're not feeling like they have to distance themselves from women in order to get ahead. Of course, if the behaviour is discriminatory or harassing, that's a different situation. And that is a situation that you need to act on. And maybe you have other tips that you are happy to share in the chat around if you have a leader or a department head who fits in this category of perhaps distancing themselves from other women, how might you deal with that challenge? I was going to do another question, which is about engaging men, but I'm going to leave that actually for questions. So if anyone wants to ask how you get men on board, that's something we can pick up a little bit later. So with that overview in mind, that there's multiple strategies, multiple levels, we can try to improve some of those outcomes that we've seen, where we are just not seeing as many women getting the grants, getting the senior leadership positions and so on. There are many levels that we can tackle that issue at. But we're really grateful today to have two ARC Laureate Fellows who have been successful as women in getting those awards and are going to share some of their thoughts and advice around what leaders and organisations can do. So first up, we'll have ARC Laureate Fellow Tessa Morris-Suzuki, who is a Professor Emerita of History at the ANU in Canberra. And she'll tell you a little bit about her research, but she specialises in the area of history of modern Japan and Asia. And next up, we will have ARC Laureate Fellow Sundhya Pahuja, who is also an ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Fellow, which means she has some responsibility in this area of mentoring women. And she's a Professor of International Law at the University of Melbourne and doing research on how law shapes inequality. So I think this is an interesting bigger picture component. We didn't go right out there into the bigger picture, but that is obviously relevant to Sundhya's research. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Tessa to hopefully share her slides. She doesn't use Teams very frequently, so she's looking for that little black square in the top right-hand corner that says share. Tessa, how are you going?
That's right. I think something is happening there.
Yes, something is happening, and we can see your slides. So go ahead. Fantastic.
Lovely, thanks. So I'm talking to you from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I thought I'd start off by saying a little bit about the Laureate project that I had from 2013 to 18, but still in some ways continuing. We were focusing on what we called informal life politics in Northeast Asia. So that's grassroots community political and social action in China, Japan, the two Koreas, Mongolia, Taiwan, and so on. And I think there were two relevant lessons that came out of that project. One was about mentoring, and the other was about crossing the borders of academia. So, you know, in my career as an academic, which sort of goes back into the mists of history, I've been involved in mentoring in various ways as somebody being mentored and as a mentor. And my experience has been that the sort of formal systems that universities set up, where they maybe pair a senior woman with a more junior woman as a mentor, are not really as effective as more flexible systems that bring together groups of people, perhaps groups of women or groups of more senior and junior scholars, and allow a sort of organic process of mentoring to emerge. So what we were trying to do in our Laureate project was to bring in a wider group of people, not just the core researchers, particularly early career researchers, and have a range of informal activities, including, you know, going off on workshops together for maybe 3 or 4 days, having various discussion series. And I think these really were quite helpful for the more junior researchers in linking them up to a number of more senior researchers. So they had this sort of resource of people who they could turn to if they had a particular question. They could identify somebody who might be able to help them with that. And I think there is a lesson there perhaps for universities to think about a relatively broad range and flexible range of mentoring schemes that they can develop for academics. And, you know, sessions like this, obviously, are also really important for mentoring purposes. The other thing that we were trying to do in our project was to link up with leaders of community projects in Northeast Asia. And it happened that many of them were women. So formal politics in the region is very male dominated, but in grassroots politics, women play a really important role. And we met a number of amazing women, some of whom we invited to talk at ANU. And I think that through that process, we didn't just learn about them, but we learned from them. And we got ideas about things that we could do in our own institutions to deal with some of the challenges that we were facing. And it was actually a fairly challenging time because our university went through a major restructure in the middle of the Laureate project. And again, I think that's something that universities could think about more broadly. How can they support women academics to link up with academics, women working in, you know, other public institutions, NGOs, and so on, and share ideas and learn from them. Then moving on more broadly to what's going on in academia, you know, in the course of my career, I've seen a lot of change. Just, you know, for example, when I started off at ANU in the early 1990s. I was in the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, and there were no women professors in the research school. It was, quite a large research school. Now in the College of Asia and the Pacific, which is sort of the successor institution, I think just over a third of level E scholars are women. So improvement, but there's still a gap, obviously. And the improvements reflect a number of good policies that universities have put in place, but clearly there's more that can be done. I just wanted to put forward 3 thoughts of things that I think universities could be doing better. I think there could be more in the way of re-entry programs for scholars who have taken time out for, various caring responsibilities or whatever. I think that there could be more flexible arrangements and funding for fieldwork to help people deal with various caring responsibilities. And I also think that there could be more flexible and accessible support for academics who feel that they are facing problems of harassment, marginalization, and so on. I think one of the problems at the moment is that people tend to think about dealing with these issues through formal complaint processes, which are obviously really necessary in some circumstances, but sometimes because the harassment and so on can be very subtle, very complex, there's a need for flexible arrangements where people can turn to somebody in the university who can give them advice, support, encouragement, ideas about how to deal with this. And I'd just like to add that in my experience in this, world of online media and so on, harassment of women academics can come from outside their own institutions, from scholars or others in other institutions, and universities need to think how to help and support their academic staff if that happens. So there are a range of things that universities can do, but there are also 2 underlying problems which I think have been weakening the position or undermining the position of women academics while other good things have been going on. And it's, you probably won't be surprised at all at what they are. So one is the casualization of the workforce in universities. Really complex issue. I won't talk about it in any detail, but clearly women have disproportionately found themselves in casual or insecure positions in universities. There are some steps that have been being taken to try and reverse that process in recent years. A couple of legal changes in 2023 and 24, I think. But we still need to see how that plays out in practice. But it's really important that we don't get a situation where more and more academics are in insecure employment and more, that is increasingly affecting women. The other trend that I think, risks making the position of women in academia more difficult, more challenging, is corporatization and bureaucratization, and I think they just absolutely go hand in hand. Corporate bureaucratization. So with funding cuts or poor policy decisions about funding for universities, universities have tended to rely on increasingly corporate models of behavior, which I think, increase the stresses, the pressures, the demands for productivity, which is often, quite doesn't produce really good quality research or teaching. And it's also come with this overload of box ticking, regulations that have to be followed, report writing, and so on. And obviously this affects all academics, but because women more often have extra caring burdens and so on, again, it's particularly difficult, I think, for women in those circumstances to find the time that they need to focus on their research, developing their teaching, and so on. It's good to see, I think, that senior people in universities are starting to ask serious questions about these issues and really try to challenge this slide that we've been facing. I just commend to you, if you haven't already, read a very recent publication called Aiming Higher, Universities and Australia's Future by the Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney Uni, George Williams, which talks very much about particularly corporatisation and some ways to reverse it and to make universities more human places, which I think, is good for everybody, men and women, but perhaps particularly important for women academics. So I think if we can recreate universities as learning communities that are really focused on students and on research that meets social values, instead of focusing on rankings and budget bottom lines, then academia will be better for everyone, but particularly for women academics. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tessa. And I was sharing earlier with these guys that I just read an article on slow academia. So you've heard of slow cooking and all these sorts of things. And it was really that last point that you made, that unfortunately this world of citations, metrics, corporatization, I guess the way things are measured really means that people are just pushing out publications, and this slow academia movement is about bringing it back to doing more high quality, fewer but high impact types of publications. So I think there's a nice tie in there. But thank you so much, Tessa, for your words of wisdom and insights. And now hand you to Sundhya for some thoughts from you.
Hi, everyone. Is my audio okay?
Yeah. And we'll just get you to stop sharing, Tessa,
yes,
if you can. But
I will try to do that, or I might need to rely
on
you.
I tell you what, I'll do it, and then I'll undo it. But Sundhya, you get going just while we're going. There we go. We're all good now.
All right. I'm low tech. I don't have any slides. So I was thinking about the composition of this audience, which includes both senior and junior people, and which includes professional staff and academic staff, I was happy to see. And I was thinking about that in relation to the topic of what can leaders and organisations do. And I thought it wasn't going to be that helpful if I just gave you a should list of what we would want organisations to be in an ideal world. So I thought I would think about two particular things. One is, what can we encourage organisations and leaders to do? And second is, how can we encourage it? And I know that some of you are in positions of leadership, so when I say what can we encourage, I would include those of us in leadership positions to think about those things. And really, I think there are three things that we could think about when we think about what can we encourage. One is to pay attention to styles of engagement. So I recently sat on a recruitment committee, and we interviewed a bunch of people. We were very attentive to who we interviewed in terms of gender and race to make sure we interviewed in a diverse way. But when we had our sort of initial who was on your shortlist meeting immediately after the interviews were concluded, it was clear that we'd all shortlisted a lot more boys than women. And we immediately noticed this, and we said to ourselves, well, why did we do that? And one of the reasons why we did that was because there was an easy and confident style of interaction that a lot of confident men demonstrated that women didn't. They tended to be more self-effacing, and the interview panel tended to believe them in their own self-effacement. So it was good that the panel had enough senior women to say, well, hang on, let's just put a check on that sort of instance of, let's call it cultural bias in a sort of social sense. But it made me think about the way that we have to think about styles and modes of communication as much as content and structure. And we can facilitate certain things, I think, that are quite useful for allowing women to shine in workplaces, and not just women, but culturally diverse people as well, who might not have that, what I tend to think of as that Aussie boy style, which tends to be affable and easy, walk into a room, stride in, take a particular stance, have a particular sense of humour, and that can be very alienating to people from migrant backgrounds and stuff, as well, as I know from my own experience working in a law firm. But so the styles that I think we should try to encourage are styles of openness and honesty around mistakes. So many professions have cultures where you conceal your mistakes, because if you reveal your mistakes, you open yourself up to blame and litigation. And in academia, I think we tend to conceal our mistakes because we don't think everybody makes them, or we think that it will be bad for us. But one of the things that I think is really positive about the workplace where I work is I think we do have a culture where you can say, I tried something and it didn't succeed, and I want you guys to help me fix it. And so, for example, when I first got my laureate, whenever I talk about getting a laureate, I always say, I applied for the laureate 3 times and I didn't get it the first 2 times. And it was really instructive to just pick myself up and try again without feeling all bruised. So and a lot of people say to me, well, it's really helpful to hear that you didn't get it the first 2 times you applied, and that it was actually useful to just go through the experience. So I think, number one, think about styles of communication and encourage styles of openness and frankness, where you actually make spaces for people to share failures as well as successes, and try to encourage and perform cultures of generosity. So the second thing I think that can be really useful, that leaders can encourage, but that we can also make happen, is to seek quite task-specific mentors. So we tend to talk a lot about mentorship in general, but in my career, I've been much more assisted by quite specific mentors. And so I think if anybody is in a position where they either want to seek mentorship or create programs of mentorship, that it works better to say, let's have a mentor program around only grants, so that the mentor doesn't have an open-ended piece of string time commitment. There's quite a specific task that they're going to help with, and the mentee has a much better sense of what they're asking for, and also in turn what they can help others with. So every act of mentoring is also an act of training a future mentee. So we have to think about reciprocity in terms of practices that we're training people into and being trained into, so that we do encourage cultures of continuous learning around things like mentoring. So one of the things that I've done before the laureate is have what I call skills circles, which is modelled on having been to a knitting circle with my mother. I was just driving my mum to this knitting circle, but what I really liked was the way that both experienced and inexperienced knitters were knitting in the same room, and often the young people had more interesting designs and the old people had better technical skills. I mean, I'm caricaturing it for the purposes of the story, but the same thing happens in academic settings, where having non-hierarchical skills circles actually helps everyone to think about what intergenerational conversations can give. So rather than just a top-down sort of thing. And I suppose the third thing is a strategic question about what can we encourage. Thinking about what's good for women is often thinking about what's good for everyone. And so as much as we can inflect our demands, I think it's quite useful to think of them as being generally beneficial to everyone, to think about flexibility. And it also means that women don't have to be the carers if they don't want to, and men can be the carers if they want to. And people have aged parents as well as small children. So thinking as much outside the box as we can in terms of who can benefit from certain cultural practices and changes is really useful. And now I've noticed I've hit 7 minutes, but I just want to say the second half of the story is, how can we encourage change? I think we have to think politically about that. And if we think we have to look down and manage our research careers and work hard for ourselves, when we look up, the university will not be there anymore. We are the university. So I would encourage everybody to exercise as much leadership as they can, no matter how junior you are, in terms of being involved in university policy making, sitting on committees, going to meetings that might seem dull, but they're where decisions get taken, and get involved in university administration and leadership as much as you can. And secondly, join the union, because as somebody once said about freedom, although it's a bit grandiose, freedom will never be given. It must always be taken. Similarly, workplace concessions will never be granted, and if they are granted in the form of supplication, they'll never be as effective as if they are demanded. So the whole stuff about anti-casualisation and legislative change has only happened because of solidaristic agitation between continuing and casual staff and demands through a union. So I don't think that the neoliberalisation and corporatisation of the university have to be our future, although they are our present. And the only way they're not going to be part of our future is through agitation and us taking leadership. If we wait for somebody else to do it, it won't happen. So I'll stop because I've run out of time.
Thank you, Sundhya. Well, that's a beautiful note to finish on. So thank you so much to both Tessa and Sundhya for brilliant wisdom. And I'm going to hand now to Annika, who is our question answer and gatherer. And so over to you, Annika.
All right, let me share my screen. Can you see this?
Yes.
So we've got a few responses from our audience regarding positive examples of what the department or the leadership has done for them. So I'm gonna read a few of them. So this one says, my manager runs monthly career discussions in the team where postdocs can ask for help from fellow academics, for help with career planning, share any problems we're facing and how we can help each other with our career goals. And I think this resonates a lot with what Tessa has been mentioning about these informal mentoring groups. Then we also have people that mention a lot of remote work opportunities or flexibility around the way that their work is designed. Maternity leave or coming back from work. A supervisor that helped to tell the person to say no for a project as well, and make sure that the goals are aligned. We also had a webinar on saying no, I think. So yeah, great example of that. And yeah, just thank you so much for all your interaction. And the next question is an overview of what categories are supported most. So most people say flexible work arrangements, mentorship and sponsorship, leadership development, networking, and supporting the return to work. Do you want to say anything about that, Sharon?
No, that's great. But what we'll try and do is collect together those positive stories and make sure we share them on the website or somewhere. We'll let you know, because that will be great. Because again, we want to try and influence the leaders of universities that are out there. So we will make sure we share those stories more widely. But yeah, let's go with some questions now, Annika, because I know there were many.
Yes, there were. Well, first of all, I just wanted to pick up again, because you mentioned in the beginning you didn't have time to answer the question, how do we get the men on board? So maybe we start with this one, and we can also hear what Sundhya and Tessa think about it. But Sharon, I'll give the floor to you for a minute.
Okay, just look super quickly. First of all, there's reasons that men don't get involved. That go beyond straight up sexism. It's more often things like sometimes it can feel quite threatening for men to admit that there might be inequity, because then it might sort of suggest that they got their job, on the basis of inequity, and that's an uncomfortable feeling. So I think it's important to understand where men might be coming from. But what the research shows is that involving men in the process is really important. And, often men are in positions of power, so that really matters. But involving them, getting them involved, helping them to be those champions really matters. Actually, one really interesting piece of research, just I'll share briefly, was that, if you actually highlight the historical inequities of women, just like I did at the beginning, actually that actually makes men less likely to support policies. And I think it's because it triggers that feeling of uncomfortableness that, again, they might have only got their position through some sort of inequitable process. So actually what the research suggests is better to almost say, well, look, there have been issues, but things are improving. We've still got further to go. So sort of, I guess, a slightly more positive frame. I'll stop there. There are other tips as well. Actually, back in the other webinar that we did on this topic, we also talk about how to get men involved. And I think Peter chips in a little bit on that. He was the guy talking about the maths professors.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Shall we move on with another question then?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So a few people asked, in general, as a perspective from the leader, how can I support my employees or my students when they're going on maternity leave? How can I help when they're coming back, like reintegrate them into the job? Do you have any concrete tips on that? Sundhya, you're nodding. Do you want to answer first?
I'm nodding because it's a good question. Less because I have a good answer. Can I say something about the previous question actually, and
Yeah,
getting
sure.
men on board? It's funny
Go for
because
it.
Peter Taylor is a colleague of mine, and he and I do quite a few things together. And I was just thinking that this question of how to get people on board is not necessarily a question that has the same answer for every problem. And I think it helps us to think strategically about what coalitions we can build for what purpose, because in my experience, there are a lot of male allies for either direct feminist causes or for agitations which are about improving workplace culture, which also are beneficial to women. And I think finding strategic alliances in relation to each type of thing is probably a tactically useful way to think of things. I mean, law is different than physics, and so I don't know what it's like in STEM disciplines to try and find male allies. But Peter's a mathematician and I'm a lawyer, and when there have been things that we have been unhappy about in relation to university management, we've often reached out across those divides. So I think thinking strategically and tactically about all these things is always beneficial. In terms of supporting people to come back, tiny things like, I think people already mentioned this, tiny things like letting people bring their kids to work and not minding. So you would have seen a person behind me in my office, which is my daughter, who is at work with me today studying. But, if I have PhD students, just, say bring the child, breastfeed, I don't care, bring them to class. That sort of thing's really helpful. And then helping them to navigate what's available in terms of institutional financial support, like re-establishment grants and stuff, is also a really practical way. I don't know, Tessa, you might have other thoughts about that.
I think that's a really excellent answer. And really the only thing that I would add is that I think listening to each individual, actually asking them what they need. I mean, realizing you might not be able to give them everything they need, but the challenges that people face when they're coming back to work can be very varied. And I think if you can really listen to what your academic staff member most needs and try to respond to that, that's going to be a huge help. And just the listening process is really good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm scrolling through the other questions as well. And I think, Tessa, you've already mentioned a little bit about harassment, or also there was a conversation about gaslighting in the chat. And there was a question about whether there are any suggestions or examples of reporting systems that are safe for students to report academic misconduct or harassment. Whether you have any advice on that.
Yes, I think, the systems that are in place in universities already are quite varied, and don't know that I have my brain around all of them, but my experience sort of suggests to me that it would be really useful to have systems that are a little bit more open and flexible and well advertised, so people know that they're there, that would allow people who are having these sorts of problems to go and talk to somebody in an open-ended way, somebody who's going to be sympathetic, who's going to listen carefully, who's going to be able to give good advice about the range of different ways to go forward. And that might be anything from kind of formal proceedings to get rid of somebody who's bullying or harassing, to other sorts of support, helping people to form networks that will support and help them to get through a difficult situation. And as I say, with things like the possibility of harassment coming from outside the institution, where the institution itself often may not be able to do anything very directly, I think it's very important nonetheless for institutions to be able to provide advice and support.
Yeah. Any thoughts from you, Sharon or Sundhya, on this point?
I'll just quickly add to that. And I think, Tessa, you made the point earlier that we need flexible systems. Actually, it's really important to allow informal resolution of these issues too. I think people are very scared of that. And so there's a temptation to push people down formal routes, but that can really escalate things badly. And so I would always encourage, is there an informal way to address the issue? It might be a trusted colleague who can, help mediate a situation, but we shouldn't be scared of those informal processes, because actually they can save a hell of a lot of time and grief in the long term. Of course, if they don't work, there's still formal recourses and policies and things too, but don't be afraid to solve these problems in more informal ways as well, or to try to at least. And then if they fail, there are still formal courses. Sometimes, honestly, people are behaving in ignorant ways, and you need to just let them know. Or a senior colleague might let them know on your behalf. But you may not need to be going down a formal reporting harassment case in all situations.
Yeah, I completely agree, because university HR, with the best will in the world, has very formalised compliance mechanisms, and once you get that train moving, you will lose control of it. So I think it's extremely difficult to stop the juggernaut once you start it, and finding informal ways of dealing with things first is definitely preferable.
Awesome. Shall we end on a positive note and ask?
Yeah, share a good story or something, Annika. That would be great.
Do you have maybe a tip in one word or one sentence on how we can equalize promotion and equalize recruitment? Sorry, Tessa, you want to start?
Well, I really like Sundhya's point about thinking about the style of communication. I think that is a really important point. I've seen issues like that come up again and again in recruitment and promotion processes. So I think that's a great suggestion. I would encourage people to go with that.
If I can very quickly share a story, I once saw a researcher who was researching men and women's styles in interviews. It had a video of a woman in an interview and a video of a man. And the woman was like we would all probably be, humble, self-effacing, things I could learn, and then the man just got there and was so confident, and it was striking to watch, because I was like, I'm exactly like that woman in an interview. But when you see it, it's startling how different it comes across, and how, people will not, tend towards the leader, the think man, think manager, think manager, think man, and that assertive, confident thing is so enticing for interview panels. So I think it's a great point you made, Sundhya, and echoed by you, Tessa, around those styles. It's not just the formal processes. We've got to look at the informal stuff as well. Sundhya, you get the last word now.
Well, it's not really on point, but when I was a baby academic and I had my first job, the university gave me, I was lucky enough to be given an amazing mentor through this Women in Leadership program. And she was a professor of diversity and change and leadership, and she specialised in different styles of leadership. Her name's Amanda Sinclair. And I remember having a meeting with Amanda early on, and I was complaining about the dean at the time, who none of you will know, I'm sure. He's long gone. He's an American guy. And, you know, I was like literally a baby, just got a job that year. And Amanda simply said to me, and, you know, I was cataloguing the problems of this guy. And she said, well, how will you lead? And that question changed my career, because it was like, I don't have to think of myself as an ECR. I don't have to think of myself as a level B. She said to me, how will you lead? And it was so powerful that I think it absolutely made me see that you can exercise leadership and promote change, I should say, no matter where in the institution you stand. So you don't have to juniorize yourself, which is another thing that I think women have a tendency to do. So power to you is what I would say.
What a beautiful note to end on.
That's a
so
great note
thank
to
you.
end on.
We're right at time, but thank you to our wonderful laureates, Sundhya and Tessa. Thank you so much. Thank you to Annika for the great question asking. And of course, thank you to the people behind the scenes, Eleanor, but also for all of you for giving up your precious time for coming today. And we look forward to seeing you next year. I think this is our last one for the year. So thank you all, and happy festive season. It's a long way away, but happy festive season, and look forward to seeing everybody back in the new year.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.